I'm okay. It was much more emotional than I thought, and I found it very hard to speak outside the court.
For years, people wondered where Cliff Richard had gone. Now, the truth is finally coming out. In 2025, as the world prepared to celebrate yet another milestone in British music, Cliff Richard quietly announced what few thought they'd see again. At 85 years old, the man who once ruled the charts, outlasted entire generations of pop stars, and survived one of the most humiliating public scandals in British history, was stepping back onto the stage. 18 shows, multiple countries, a tour that even his closest friends once believed would never happen. And yet, there he was, standing before thousands who never stopped loving him. The announcement sent shockwaves through his loyal fan base. Some hadn't seen him live in decades. Others wondered how he still had the strength. But beneath the excitement, there was something unspoken, a mystery that had followed him for years. Because while Cliff Richard was returning now, there had been a long stretch of silence before this. A period when he vanished from the spotlight, not officially retired, not entirely gone. Just absent. It wasn't always this way. For more than half a century, Cliff seemed unstoppable. Hit after hit, decade after decade, an unbroken line of success that no British artist had matched. He had become more than a singer. He was part of Britain's cultural identity. But all of that changed one summer morning in 2014. The world watched live as helicopters hovered over Cliff's Berkshire home. Police streamed onto his property. News cameras captured every moment. The BBC had been tipped off in advance, coordinating with police to broadcast what they secretly called the money shot. Cliff wasn't arrested. He wasn't charged. But none of that mattered. His private world was violated in front of millions. In that instant, his name was tied to a scandal that would haunt him for years, even after it was proven false. It was a brutal public unmasking, and for many, it explained his sudden withdrawal. The media circus, the court battles, the exhaustion, all of it seemed like enough to push any man into hiding. But the real story, the full truth of Cliff Richard's long disappearance, was far more complicated. Because what finally drove him into the shadows wasn't just public humiliation or legal warfare. It was something far older, far deeper. It was heartbreak. A heartbreak that stretched back 50 years. One that no trial, no settlement, no apology could erase. He loved her quietly while the world only saw their smiles. For decades, Cliff Richard carried a secret that few outside his closest circle ever fully understood. It wasn't part of the tabloid scandals or the BBC headlines. It was deeper, more personal, and for him, far more painful. Her name was Olivia Newton-John. They met in 1971 on the set of his television show, It's Cliff Richard. She was a young Australian singer with a sweet voice and effortless charm. From the moment she walked on stage, something clicked. Cliff would later admit that within moments he felt a bond. A connection that would last more than 50 years. But while fans saw a beautiful friendship unfold in public performances, shared duets, and endless interviews filled with laughter, few realized what was truly happening behind those rehearsed smiles. Because by the time Cliff fell for Olivia, her heart already belonged to someone else. Bruce Welch, Cliff's own bandmate from the shadows, the man who had stood beside him as they built their careers together, was now engaged to the woman Cliff quietly loved. The triangle was as complicated as it was painful. Bruce was still legally married when his relationship with Olivia began, igniting headlines even in those more conservative times. Their romance was intense, volatile, and public. For 5 years, Bruce and Olivia remained engaged, but the wedding never came. Meanwhile, Cliff stayed close to both of them, swallowing his feelings, never daring to interfere. Rumors swirled for years. Some insiders whispered that Olivia's friendship with Cliff was more than just professional. That maybe, in the quiet moments off stage, something unspoken passed between them. But Cliff never crossed that line. He held his distance. He performed alongside her, sang harmonies that seemed effortless, and watched her life unfold from a polite distance. Even after Olivia left Bruce, after her own life took her to America and global superstardom with Grease, Cliff remained her friend. Through marriages, divorces, cancer battles, and comebacks, they stayed connected. Over 4 decades of shared history, their voices blended in duet after duet, their smiles lighting up countless stages. But behind every song was the silent ache Cliff carried, the love he never spoke aloud. In 2020, Cliff finally revealed the truth in his autobiography. He confessed that he had loved Olivia deeply, but had never acted on it. He had lost his chance before he ever really had it. Then, in 2022, came the final call. 3 weeks before her death, Cliff phoned Olivia. She sounded cheerful, upbeat, as though everything was still normal. "Good day, Cliff. How are you, darling?" she said with her usual warmth. There was no hint of finality in her voice. Cliff would later write that during that call, he never once imagined it would be their last, but it was. When Olivia died, part of Cliff vanished too. The world knew him as Cliff Richard, but long before the stage lights, the screaming fans, and the sold-out stadiums, he was simply Harry Roger Webb, a boy born into a collapsing empire. October 14th, 1940, British India. As bombs fell across Europe during World War II, another kind of war was unfolding in India. Anti-colonial protests simmered, independence movements erupted, and by the mid-1940s, British rule was crumbling. The Webb family watched as the world they knew unraveled around them. In 1948, when it became clear that their time in India was over, the Webbs packed their belongings and joined hundreds of other British families fleeing the colony. There was no private jet or luxury cruise waiting. They boarded a crowded ship, the SS Ranchi, and spent 3 long weeks crossing the Indian Ocean. The life of sunshine and servants was replaced by cold English winters and ration books. They settled into a small house in Carshalton, Surrey. The spacious colonial estate was gone. Now it was cramped rooms and endless gray skies. For young Harry, the sudden fall from comfort planted something inside him. A quiet, burning determination to make something of himself, to create a life far bigger than the he'd been handed. And so, the reinvention began. When a music manager named Harry Greatorex spotted him, he offered simple but life-changing advice. "You need a name that sounds like rock." They chose Cliff. Solid, British, immovable. Richard came next. A nod to Little Richard, the wild American rock pioneer. Harry Webb disappeared. Cliff Richard was born. In 1958, at just 18, Cliff recorded Move It. The song was raw, loud, and unlike anything Britain had heard before. Until then, British pop was polite, clean, and heavily influenced by American imports. But Move It was different. It had teeth. It had attitude. Cliff wasn't copying America. He was creating Britain's own rock and roll voice. The song exploded. It reached number 2 on the UK charts and set off a cultural earthquake. For the first time, British teenagers had their own rock idol. Cliff Mania was born, and the country had never seen anything like it. Girls screamed, boys glared. Security struggled to hold back swarming fans at every concert. It wasn't just music, it was a movement. And then came the Beatles. As the 1960s roared to life, many assumed Cliff would be swept aside by the tidal wave of Beatlemania. But even John Lennon famously admitted, before Cliff Richard and Move It, there was nothing worth listening to in British music. Paul McCartney once said, "The Beatles left for Hamburg because Cliff had the entire UK sewn up." Cliff held his ground. While the Beatles stormed America, Cliff quietly racked up hit after hit back home. He was steady, reliable, unshaken. But even as his career soared, a different kind of storm was quietly building. In 1966, at the peak of his fame, Cliff Richard did something no one expected. He didn't release a controversial album. He didn't get arrested like many rock stars of his time. He stood on stage next to American evangelist Billy Graham at Earl's Court, in front of thousands, and declared publicly that he had become a born-again Christian. The moment was broadcast across Britain. For fans, it was shocking. For the music industry, it was terrifying. Can a rock star believe in God? In the 1960s, rock music wasn't just about songs. It was rebellion. It was counterculture. The icons of the era pushed boundaries, experimented with drugs, challenged social norms, and turned their backs on religion. Cliff's announcement felt like a direct contradiction to everything rock was supposed to represent. Whispers filled the industry. Managers feared he would lose his fan base. Record executives questioned whether radio stations would still play his songs. Agents quietly pulled back. The safe assumption was simple. Cliff Richard's career was finished. Even Cliff wasn't sure. Privately, he wrestled with his faith and his future. Could he still sing love songs? Could he stand on stage and perform for crowds while preaching purity and devotion off stage? Was it hypocritical to romance while committing himself to a life guided by Christian values? The pressure to walk away entirely was real. He even considered leaving the entertainment world altogether and becoming a teacher. For months, the uncertainty weighed on him. But Cliff made a decision that would shape his entire life. He didn't quit. He didn't choose one world over the other. Instead, he built something new. Cliff Richard became the first major British pop star to fully embrace both his faith and his fame. He didn't hide his beliefs, but he didn't abandon the stage either. He continued recording, touring, and performing, only now as an openly devout Christian. He refused to follow the image of the reckless, out-of-control rock idol. He showed that it was possible to have screaming fans and still speak about God on national television. This choice rewrote the rules. Cliff carved out a unique identity that no one else in British music had occupied before. He became an icon not just for his music, but for his principles. For many fans, this made him even more beloved. For others, it marked him as an outsider in an industry that preferred its stars reckless and broken. Cliff thought he had found balance. He thought he could live both lives without consequence. He thought he was safe. He was wrong. By the mid-1970s, Cliff Richard's career was fading. The teenagers who once screamed his name had grown up. New sounds dominated the airwaves. Glam rock, punk, and disco were rewriting the rules. For the first time in his career, Cliff went an entire year without placing a single song in the charts. The industry quietly wondered if his time had finally passed. And then, when almost no one expected it, he came back. In April 1976, Devil Woman hit the airwaves. It was unlike anything Cliff had released before. Darker, edgier, the song told a strange story of a cursed encounter with a psychic and a mysterious stray cat. It was raw, driving, and undeniably catchy. The British public responded immediately. The single shot to number 9 in the UK. Even more surprising, it cracked the American charts, reaching number 6, Cliff's first major success in the United States. It wasn't just the public that took notice. Some of rock's biggest legends, long dismissed as far too cool for the clean-cut Cliff, openly expressed their admiration. Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, Eric Clapton, and Elton John were all seen wearing I'm Nearly Famous badges, promoting his comeback album of the same name. Suddenly, Cliff wasn't just surviving. He was earning the respect of artists who had once defined rebellion itself. And Cliff didn't stop there. The 1980s brought more reinvention. In 1987, he released Always Guaranteed, an album inspired by the slick production values of Thriller, but avoiding the cheesy synth-heavy trends that plagued much of the decade. The album went platinum, peaking at number 5 on the UK charts and staying there for 24 straight weeks. Singles, like Some People, soared into the top 10, proving that Cliff could compete with a new generation of stars. Then came Christmas 1988. Mistletoe and Wine became an instant classic. Though recorded in the heat of summer with tinsel draped over microphones, the song captured the holiday spirit perfectly. It shot to number 1 within a week of release, selling over 750,000 copies in just 6 weeks. It would go on to become one of the most enduring Christmas songs in British music history, earning Cliff yet another platinum certification. But his most stunning record came in 1990 with Savior's Day. Released just before Christmas, it climbed to number 1, giving Cliff the rare distinction of having topped the UK charts in 5 consecutive decades. The 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and now the 90s. No other British artist had done it. For most, this would be the triumphant high point of a career. Cliff had proven his resilience, his adaptability, and his lasting appeal. His chart success was unmatched. His fan base was as loyal as ever. And yet, beneath the platinum records and sold-out concerts, there was a quiet, lingering question. For all the charts he conquered, Why did he remain so alone? On August 14, 2014, Cliff Richard was sitting quietly at his home in Portugal when the nightmare began. He flipped on the television, expecting background noise. What he saw instead stopped his heart. Live aerial footage showed helicopters circling his Berkshire property. Police officers moved across his lawn like an invading force. Vans blocked the gates. Cameras zoomed in on every detail, and the world watched it unfold in real time. At first, Cliff thought he was witnessing a robbery, burglars, a break-in, but as the familiar sight of police uniforms came into focus, a cold realization washed over him. This wasn't a crime scene. He was the target. What Cliff didn't know at that moment was that the BBC had already struck a secret deal with South Yorkshire Police. The broadcaster had been tipped off about the raid in advance. Internally, BBC producers called it the money shot. It was the perfect storm for live television, an iconic celebrity, an unfolding investigation, and the irresistible promise of scandal. There had been no arrest, no formal charges, just an unproven allegation. A single claim that nearly 3 decades earlier, at a 1985 Billy Graham rally, Cliff had assaulted a man. But the moment the footage aired, the damage was done. Across Britain and around the world, headlines exploded. Cliff Richard's name was now tied to sexual abuse, his reputation shredded before any evidence had been presented, a lifetime of spotless reputation reduced to one false allegation. As the footage played again and again on news broadcasts, Cliff sat alone, stunned and powerless. Panic attacks soon followed. He couldn't sleep. His heart raced uncontrollably. He lost weight, developed shingles, and collapsed from exhaustion. Even in his own home, he no longer felt safe. "My house felt contaminated," he would later say. "I couldn't even walk through it without feeling sick." The 2-year investigation that followed was equally brutal. Police combed through every detail of his life, searching for more accusations. They interrogated friends, staff, and security officers who had been present at the event in question. Several officers confirmed they had been by Cliff's side that entire night. They were never interviewed. The allegation itself began to unravel. The accuser described a specific room where the assault allegedly happened, only for investigators to discover that the room didn't even exist in 1985. The sports equipment mentioned was stored elsewhere. The story was crumbling. Still, the investigation dragged on for 22 long months. No charges were ever filed. The evidence simply wasn't there because the crime never happened. But the humiliation couldn't be undone. Cliff's name had been splashed across front pages. His face had been shown on screens while police rummaged through his most private belongings. The stain lingered. Worse still, while Cliff battled for his reputation, the BBC submitted its raid footage for Scoop of the Year. As he struggled to hold his life together, the very images of his public humiliation were being celebrated within broadcasting circles. It was a level of arrogance that would later be called humiliating and unlawful by the courts. But at the time, Cliff could only watch, helpless. He tried to stay composed, but the weight was crushing. Some days he couldn't lift his arms. Other days he couldn't stop crying. A man who had spent his life controlling his image was now paralyzed by the world's judgment. But the real betrayal was still to come. For most people, surviving such public humiliation would have been the end. But Cliff Richard had spent his entire life facing storms. This time, he decided to fight back. What began as a police investigation soon turned into something far bigger. Cliff wasn't only battling an accusation, he was battling the very institutions that had profited from his downfall. At the center of it all stood the BBC, the national broadcaster that had arranged, filmed, and globally aired the raid on his home. The arrogance was breathtaking. While Cliff was still under investigation, his career in ruins, the BBC quietly submitted its raid coverage for Scoop of the Year. They saw it as award-worthy journalism. For Cliff, it was salt in a wound that had barely begun to heal. They were celebrating the very images that had nearly destroyed him. In 2016, Cliff filed a lawsuit against both South Yorkshire Police and the BBC. It wasn't just about money. It was about principle. It was about restoring something even more precious than his career, his name. The case dragged through the courts for 2 years. In the courtroom, Cliff delivered emotional testimony that shook everyone listening. As he read aloud the list of countries where the footage had been broadcast, his voice cracked. The weight of global humiliation pressed on him, even as he tried to stay composed. "I feel smeared, even though I was cleared," he told the court. He spoke about the nights he couldn't sleep, about the shame that followed him into public places, about how even casual eye contact with strangers now felt dangerous. The headlines may have faded, but the suspicion lingered. The damage was irreversible. Finally, in July 2018, the ruling came down. The judge sided with Cliff. The BBC had violated his privacy in a serious, sensationalist, and unlawful way. South Yorkshire police admitted their role in tipping off the media. Cliff was awarded substantial damages and legal costs. That didn't just vindicate him, it changed British media law. For decades, British journalists had reported police investigations as soon as suspects were identified, even if they hadn't been charged. The Cliff Richard case forced a legal shift. From that day forward, individuals under investigation would have greater rights to privacy unless formally charged. No longer could the media treat suspicion like guilt. Cliff had won, but even in victory, he struggled to celebrate. The public apology, the financial compensation, the legal reforms, none of it erased the scars. "The damage was already done," he said quietly. "I will always live with what people saw." It wasn't just a legal battle. It had become a fight for his very identity. And while the courts restored his legal rights, no judge could undo what had been taken from him that day when the helicopters first appeared over his home. When the cameras turned away and the headlines moved on, Cliff Richard was left alone with the wreckage. The courtroom victory had cleared his name on paper, but in his heart, the wounds were still fresh. What followed were the quietest years of his career, the years where the spotlight dimmed and Cliff seemed to disappear. The psychological toll was heavier than anyone outside his circle truly understood. The man who had once stood confidently on the world's biggest stages now struggled to sleep through the night. Anxiety wrapped itself around him. Some days, he couldn't bring himself to leave the house. Other days, he felt crushed by the weight of invisible judgment. Even simple encounters with strangers left him wondering, do they believe what was said about me? His body carried the burden too. The exhaustion led to physical collapse, shingles, weight loss, fainting spells. His health buckled under the relentless strain. The energy that once fueled decades of constant performance was drained. He had spent over half a century reinventing himself, adjusting to new sounds, new audiences, new eras. But this time, there was no creative solution. The silence became his only protection. For several years, Cliff stopped releasing major new work. Albums that might have been recorded sat on hold. Tours were postponed or quietly canceled. The man who had once defined British pop music seemed to vanish. The media, once obsessed with every movement of his life, grew quiet too. Without scandal to feed on, the cameras moved elsewhere, and for a time, it felt as though Cliff Richard had slipped into a kind of living exile. But behind that silence, one thing kept him anchored: his faith. The same faith that once threatened to end his career in the 1960s now became his refuge. It gave him the strength to withstand public disgrace, to find peace in prayer when the world refused to offer any. And beyond his own quiet resilience, there was something else: his loyal fans. They never left. Letters continued to arrive. Messages of support poured in. At his lowest moments, he would reread their words, reminders that he was not as alone as the silence made him feel. The world may have forgotten for a time, but Cliff Richard was still standing, waiting, healing. The announcement came quietly at first, a simple press release. A few headlines, but as the news spread, the reaction was nothing short of stunned disbelief. Cliff Richard was going back on tour. At 85 years old, after years of silence, legal battles, heartbreak, and personal exile, the man many assumed had retired was preparing to step back onto the stage. And not just any stage. This was an 18-day tour, stretching across the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. His first return down under in more than a decade. For fans who had followed him since the beginning, it felt almost surreal. They had grown up with him, raised families, with his songs playing softly in the background. And now, in 2025, They would get one more chance to see him live. To many, it was a miracle. To Cliff, it was something more. It was survival. Most men would have quit decades ago. Cliff Richard never did. His body may have slowed, but his voice remained remarkably strong. His presence on stage, after more than 6 decades, still commanded attention. But even before the tour announcement, signs of his resilience had quietly surfaced. In 2023, he released Cliff with Strings, My Kinda Life, a sweeping orchestral remix album that reimagined his biggest hits. The album debuted at number 5 on the UK charts, making him one of the only artists in history to chart top 5 albums across 8 consecutive decades. While newer pop stars came and went, Cliff's name still held weight. The tour sold out quickly. Tickets vanished as lifelong fans, some now bringing grandchildren, rushed to secure seats. For many, this wasn't just another concert. It was a final chance to say thank you, to witness the man who had defined their youth and somehow was still standing. As the first shows drew near, the anticipation built into something larger than nostalgia. It was defiance. Cliff Richard had weathered scandals that could have destroyed any career, endured personal heartbreak that quietly shaped every song, and outlived nearly every peer who once shared his spotlight. Yet here he was, smiling, performing, unbroken. But is this his final act, or just one more chapter? There has never been another career quite like his. 8 decades, more than 100 charted singles, 65 top 10 hits, 14 number ones, stadiums filled, records shattered, generations moved by his songs. Cliff Richard's legacy as a pop icon is undeniable, unmatched in British music history. But beneath the numbers, behind the sparkling awards and standing ovations, was a far more complicated story, a paradox few fully understood. He was the eternal showman who never married, the pop idol who watched the woman he loved commit to someone else, the clean-cut star who stood firm in his faith while others chased excess, the beloved national treasure who, with one single allegation, became the face of a scandal he never deserved. Cliff Richard was, at once, one of the most adored and most wounded men in modern entertainment. The 2014 raid cast a shadow that still lingers. Though the investigation led to no charges, though the courts ruled in his favor, though the BBC was publicly shamed, the stain of suspicion proved harder to erase. The image of helicopters circling his home, of officers tearing through his private life while cameras rolled, became burned into public memory, and Cliff knew that no legal ruling could fully undo what the world had seen. But for all that was taken from him, one thing never wavered: his faith. It was faith that sustained him through his earliest struggles as a boy fleeing British India, faith that carried him through the music industry's doubts when he openly declared his Christianity in the middle of the 1960s cultural revolution, faith that kept him grounded as he watched his friends fall to addiction, scandal, or heartbreak, and faith that allowed him to survive the years of silent humiliation after the BBC raid. He may have lost everything, but never lost himself. Through all the storms, personal, professional, and public, Cliff Richard never abandoned the core of who he was. He chose, again and again, to keep going, not with bitterness, but with grace, not with anger, but with gratitude. Even as new generations rose to fame, even as the industry shifted around him, Cliff continued to fill concert halls. The 2025 tour was not just a celebration of his longevity, it was a declaration. Proof that no scandal, no betrayal, no heartbreak could erase what he had built. Fans who packed those arenas knew they were witnessing more than just a concert. They were witnessing resilience. The kind of resilience that only comes from enduring the deepest losses while refusing to surrender. For Cliff, the story was never just about the music. It was never just about the charts or the fame. It was about survival, about remaining true when the world tried to rewrite him, about holding on to something bigger than applause. And maybe, after 85 years, Cliff Richard's greatest story isn't the songs or the scandals, it's that he survived.